My parents did not visit me once in 31 days while I was in the ICU. Not once. Not a phone call to the nurse's station, not a card, not a single message asking if I was alive. My brother did not come either. I found out later that both of them knew, from day one, exactly how serious it was. I woke up on day 32, weak and confused and grateful simply to be breathing on my own again. And 3 days after I was discharged, my mother called me with the first thing she had said to me in over a month. She did not ask how I was healing. She asked when I was going to sign the house over to my brother. Before I tell you how I answered that question, let me ask you one. If the people who were supposed to show up for you disappeared completely when you needed them the most, would you still feel obligated to hand them everything you own the moment they resurfaced with a demand instead of an apology? Sit with that for a second, because by the end of this story, I think your answer might surprise you. And if you like stories like this one, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go any further. This channel is small right now, and it grows one person at a time, one subscribe at a time, more than it ever grows from people just watching and scrolling past. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Okay, here's what happened. My name is Rachel Ainsworth. I am 34 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado, where I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown. I grew up in a family of 4. My father, Walter, my mother, Diane, my older brother, Connor, who is 38. Connor was always the favorite. I don't say that bitterly. I say it the way you'd describe a fact of geography, something you grew up inside of, and eventually stopped questioning because questioning it never changed anything. Connor got the new car when he turned 16. I got our mother's old sedan with a cracked windshield. Connor's college was paid for outright. Mine was paid for in loans I am, to this day, still finishing off. Connor married young, had 2 kids, and moved 11 minutes from our parents' house. I moved to Denver for work and built a life that looked, from the outside, successful and stable and entirely my own. I bought my house 4 years ago, a small brick 2-bedroom on a quiet street, paid for with a down payment I saved for over 6 years by living far more carefully than anyone around me realized. It was the first thing that was ever completely, unquestionably mine. Stay with me, because that house is about to become the entire center of this story. About 3 months ago, I was driving home from a job site when a truck ran a red light and hit my car on the driver's side. I don't remember most of what happened next. I remember the sound. I remember waking up in an ambulance for a few seconds, and then nothing else, until I woke up in a hospital bed, 3 days later, with tubes in places I didn't want to think about, and a doctor explaining, slowly and carefully, that I had internal bleeding, 2 fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, and a head injury, serious enough that they had kept me sedated to reduce swelling. I was in the ICU for 31 days. My emergency contact was my mother. The hospital told me later that they had called her the night of the accident. They called her again 2 days later when my condition worsened. They called her a 3rd time when I needed emergency surgery to stop internal bleeding that had started again. She answered all 3 calls. She did not come. I asked a nurse, once I was lucid enough to ask anything, whether anyone had visited while I was under. The nurse checked the log. 0 visitors. 31 days. I lay there processing that information, the way you process something too large to actually feel all at once. It didn't hit me as grief. It hit me as a kind of quiet, clinical disbelief. The same feeling you get reading about someone else's life and thinking, that can't be real. Surely that's not how it actually happened. But it was how it happened. I was discharged on day 32 into a recovery process that would take months. A friend from work, Priya, picked me up from the hospital because I genuinely had no one else to call. She stayed with me for the first week, helped me shower, helped me get to follow-up appointments, helped me eat, because chewing still hurt. My mother called on day 3 of my recovery at home. I answered, foolishly hoping this was finally the conversation where she explained herself, or apologized, or asked how I was doing. She said, "Rachel, we need to talk about the house." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Your father and I have been thinking. With everything going on with Connor's business, and the kids getting older, it just makes sense for the house to go to him eventually. We think now is a good time to start the paperwork." I sat there in stunned silence for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. I said, "I was in the ICU for 31 days. None of you came, not once." She said, "The hospital said you were stable. We didn't want to crowd you while you were healing." I said, "You didn't call to check. You didn't ask if I was alive." She said, "We're your parents, Rachel. We know you're a fighter. We knew you'd be fine." I said, "What does that have to do with my house?" She said, "It's just a house, Rachel. You can buy another one. Connor has a family to think about." I hung up the phone. I sat in my living room, in the house I had spent 6 years saving for, still recovering from injuries that had nearly killed me, and I understood something with total clarity for the first time in my adult life. They had never actually seen me as someone who needed protecting. They had only ever seen me as someone who would survive without it, which made me, in their eyes, the perfect person to ask for things. My father called 2 days later. He didn't ask how I was healing either. He said, "Your mother says you're being difficult about the house." I said, "I was in a coma-adjacent state for a month, Dad. None of you showed up." He said, "We're not the kind of family that does hospital visits. You know that." I said, "You're my parents." He said, "We knew you'd pull through. Connor needs this more than you do right now. His business took a hit last year." I asked the question I had been avoiding. I said, "Is this why you didn't come? Because you already knew what you were going to ask me for, and it was easier to ask if you hadn't spent a month sitting next to my hospital bed feeling guilty about it." He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The silence told me everything I needed to know. Here's the part of the story most people don't see coming. 2 weeks after that phone call, Connor showed up at my door, not my parents. Connor, in person, for the first time since the accident. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy for me. He said, "Rachel, I know this looks bad, but I need you to understand what's actually happening." I let him in. I wanted to hear it. He told me his landscaping business, the one he had built with money our parents quietly funneled into for years, was 6 months behind on a business loan secured against his own house. If he didn't come up with a significant amount of capital within 90 days, he was going to lose everything: his house, his equipment, possibly the business itself. Our parents' solution was not to help him directly. Their solution was to have me sign my house over to him so he could use it as collateral to refinance and buy himself time. My house. The one thing that belonged to me and only me. Being offered up, without my consent, as the answer to a crisis I had no part in creating. I said, "Why didn't they just tell me that from the beginning?" Connor said, "Because they knew you'd say no, if you understood how bad it actually was. And they were hoping you'd say yes out of guilt, before you had time to think it through." That was, at least, an honest answer. I looked at my brother, a man I had spent my entire childhood watching get everything first and easiest, sitting in my living room asking me to hand over the only thing I had ever built entirely on my own. I said, "I need you to leave, Connor. Not because I don't care what happens to you, because I need to think, and I can't think clearly with you in this room hoping I'll say yes before I do." He left. I spent the next 4 days doing something I should have done years earlier. I called an attorney. Not because I wanted to fight my family in court, because I wanted to understand, clearly and completely, exactly what my rights were and exactly what pressure they could legally put on me. The attorney told me what I already suspected, but needed to hear from someone with no emotional stake in the outcome. Nobody could force me to sign anything. Not my parents, not Connor, not 31 days of silence dressed up afterward as concern. I called my mother back 1 week after Connor's visit. I said, "I know about Connor's business. I know why you actually want the house." She was quiet for a moment. I said, "I want you to understand something clearly, because I am only going to say this once. I am not signing my house over to Connor. Not now. Not in 6 months. Not ever. Under this kind of pressure. From people who could not be bothered to call a hospital and ask if I was still breathing." She said, "You're punishing your brother for something that isn't his fault." I said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting the one thing I built, while all 3 of you were building a version of our family where I don't actually matter unless I'm useful." She said, "That's not fair." I said, 31 days, Mom. 0 visitors. I have the hospital log if you'd like to see it." She didn't respond to that. I said, "I love you. I mean that, even now. But I am done being the daughter who gets remembered only when something is needed from her. If Connor needs help, I hope he finds it. It is not going to come from my house, and it is not going to come from my silence about what the last month actually looked like." I hung up the phone for the second time in one conversation with my mother, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty afterward. It has been 3 weeks since that call. My parents have not called since. Connor sent one text, which I have not answered yet, and may not answer for a while longer, because some conversations need more distance before they can happen honestly. I am still healing. My ribs still ache some mornings. I still have a scar across my abdomen that will never fully fade. But I am healing in my own house, on my own terms, having finally understood something that took 31 days of silence and one shameless phone call to teach me. Love that only shows up when it wants something is not love. It is just a very patient kind of use. If this story meant something to you, the best thing you can do isn't leaving a comment. It's hitting that subscribe button right now, so you don't miss the next one. That's genuinely what keeps this channel going. New story every week. Every single one earns its ending.